PTSD has a complex history. In addition to occupying the pages of nonfiction, it has held a special place in the pages of the most creative of writing. William Shakespeare, a master of the English language, wrote the play Henry IV, Part 1 in 1570, and it is from this play that he has been considered an early chronicler of PTSD. The antagonist of the title character, Sir Henry Percy, exhibits common symptoms of PTSD, and his wife, Lady Percy, engages with him in a dramatic monologue that seems to be lifted straight from the pages of a case study. She exclaims, "Thy spirit within thee hath been so at war, and thus hath so bestirred thee in thy sleep, that beads of sweat have stood upon thy brow, like bubbles in a late disturbed stream. And in thy face strange motions have appeared, such as we see when men restrain their breath on some great sudden hess." Now, it's important to note that historical scholarship forms the most exhaustive source for studying PTSD. So by collating sources from the ancient past, the recent past, and analyzing how the Vietnam War has affected current treatment modes, we can hopefully gain a broader and fresher perspective on a well-known topic. We began in ancient Egypt, a land that has given us the great pyramids of Giza and austere pharaohs. But despite the fearsome nature of the Egyptian empire, it's important to note that they weren't any less human than we are, as evidenced from a quote from one of their military scribes, Hori. Hori writes, "You determine to go forward, but shuddering seizes you. The hairs on the back of your head stand on end, and your soul lies in your hand." Another example from ancient times comes from ancient Greece at the Battle of Thermopylae Pass in 480 BC, where Greek and Spartan defenders tried to hold off a Persian force intent on conquering the known world. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of the Spartan king Leonidas waving his men off from combat. They had no heart for the fight. They were no longer willing to take their share of the danger. Even Leonidas, leader of the fearless Spartans, could recognize the limits of man. The first important example in the recent past when studying PTSD has to be the terming of nostalgia in medieval Switzerland in 1678. Nostalgia was termed to ascribe a myriad of symptoms that included stupor, fever, homesickness, and even melancholy. But the most important event of the 20th century in terms of studying PTSD has to be World War I. The outbreak of war in 1914 brought with it perfected long-range artillery, chemical gas warfare, tanks, and machine guns. And all of these things elevated war to a terrifying level of destructiveness. And it was in 1915 that British psychologist and psychiatrist Charles Myers coined the term shell shock to describe how the reverberation of an artillery strike changed the physiology of the brain. Now, it was upon further assessing the very ghastly nature of trench warfare that Myers eventually concluded that shell shock was indeed a psychological and not physiological condition. And the British Army was very receptive to this idea, as it meant that they could rehabilitate their troops and send them back to the front lines. So in 1916, special forward treatment units were created, but there was a steep learning curve to be faced. Since the symptoms of shell shock never materialized themselves externally, it was hard to determine between serious psychological and mere physical conditions. And by 1917, the term shell shock was held in utter disdain, and Myers tried to publish another paper on the topic, but was actually barred from the military from doing so, as the term that he had helped to popularize had drained so many men from their army. Debates about the origin of combat reaction continued in World War II, and in 1952, in DSM-1, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the term gross stress reaction was added. But the problem with gross stress reaction is that it had one stipulation, If symptoms persisted longer than 6 months, then a new diagnosis was needed. And to make matters worse, in 1968, in the second DSM manual, growth stress reaction was removed and replaced by adjustment reaction to adult life. And this only had 3 criteria: unwanted suicidal thoughts linked to pregnancy, Ganser syndrome in prisoners who faced a death sentence, and also fear linked to combat, which wasn't specific enough in dealing with PTSD. But finally, in 1980, in DSM-3, the term post-traumatic stress disorder was added after the horrors of Vietnam and interviews with sexual assault victims and Holocaust survivors. Now, despite the sometimes inefficient and corrupt nature of Veterans Affairs, new treatments for treating PTSD have become more and more progressive as time has wore on. Treatments such as cognitive processing therapy help soldiers to tackle an irrational feeling of blame that they may hold. Other therapies such as eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing therapy help soldiers to focus on a back and forth movement while thinking of an unsettling memory until it becomes less distressing. We began on the dunes of Egypt and the pass of Thermopylae to discuss the humanity of the ancients. In medieval Switzerland, we were given the term nostalgia. In the early 20th century of war-ravaged Europe, we witnessed psychologists grapple with the crisis of treatment. In post-war America, we witnessed the removal of a term and the realization that this was indeed a mistake. And currently, we witness a new generation of psychologists intent on rectifying the blunders of the past and finally treating the invisible wounds of war. Thank you.